This might be a good way to start this podcast episode off. I have to be honest about something. When I tell people about our podcast, and especially I link them to, send them the link to season 1, I share the story of how we felt our first few episodes didn't sound right. And it was mainly because they felt a little scripted. And you know why? They were scripted. And we realized really quickly what we started this podcast was just based on just banter and conversations that you and I were having just one-on-one. It didn't feel right when it was scripted. So it felt wrong to script here because it wasn't as authentic. So I tell people that, around episode 3 or 4, we just decided to go unscripted, and it makes it a lot better. But I thought I'd start off this episode, which is why does it feel so wrong to be honest at work, with that honest truth of what I tell people about the first season.
Yeah, and especially those first couple of episodes, Pinaki. So don't take this the wrong way. And I put a little pregnant pause after that because you always know something's about to drop. Like a truth bomb is about to drop. It's like, hey, don't take this the wrong way, or no offense, but, and you always know, and it's nice because then you can kind of brace for, oh my goodness, here comes a truth bomb. Like it's going to be, there's going to be something honest about that's going to come out. And I think this is going to be a fun episode to talk about why it does feel wrong to be honest at work, because if we're going to be really super truthful and honest right now, it is hard. There's so many circumstances where it's super awkward and painful to be honest and share your truth in the workplace. So I just want to welcome everyone. This is Why Does It Feel So Wrong to Be Human at Work? I'm Chris Lee from Gallier Communications. And of course, we're here with Pinaki Kathiari from Digital Internal Communications Consultancy, Local Wisdom. And we're both in the business of helping our clients with creating great employee communications and great experiences. And every episode, we love diving into things in the workplace that do feel wrong. And, Pinaki, you and I, we never claim to have the answers, but we certainly have some really compelling questions. And so today, what we want to talk about is this: honesty. Why does it feel so wrong? I think we all want to be honest, don't we?
Right? Yeah, we want to be our authentic selves. But, have you ever been in one of those meeting icebreakers or something like that, and somebody shared something that was just a little bit too much, and you're like, ooh. But at the same time, it's some interesting conflicting feeling I do want to know you. I do want to know your true authentic self. But, maybe that should have been in a one-on-one conversation or something like that.
Yeah.
But I am a big fan of honesty at work. In fact, at Local Wisdom, we've developed 7 values that that guide us. And the first is speak with heart and sincerity is our first value. And I think it's a tough thing to grapple when we're at work. So how does it show up at work, right? When we have to be honest, when, we can't always be honest, for example, that said person who is in the icebreaker scenario. So I think it's kind of the duality of it is interesting because we want authentic, honest people around us, but at the same time, we can't always be truly open, authentic. And there's some different reasons to that as well. But yeah, how does it show up in work in your world?
I think, one of the things that's interesting about the workplace experience is even you and I right now, Pinaki, the way we're bantering on this podcast, I think generally it represents who we really are. And it's one of the things I love about doing this podcast with you, Pinaki, is we kind of let our hair down a little bit and we're just able to talk about things that we think are slightly goofy in the workplace. But there is, unquestionably, when you're in the workplace, we bring a slightly different version of ourselves. It's a little bit more polished. We try to use bigger words. We're not slipping into slang or patois or things like that. We try to, I guess it's a subtle form of code switching in a way, right? You're trying to look and sound like a middle-aged white man. And that tends to be a lot of the corporate culture around us. And so what it means is, as much progress as there's been in the last, decade or so, I do still feel like it's already the environment is set up so that you kind of have to bring the best version of yourself and the most well-behaved version of yourself to the office. And, it's rare to find workplaces where people can be honest, but I also feel like sometimes people are not good at being honest. They're a little bit blunt. They can be disrespectful. And I think honesty is not about, I think respect is a big part of that. And how do you be honest, but also at the same time being thoughtful of how people might receive your honesty?
That's so true. Even for your first point about being your true authentic selves, I mean, like, I grew up in Hoboken, New Jersey. For anyone who hasn't been to New Jersey, New Jersey as either the Jersey Shore or the Sopranos. I'm more of the Sopranos. I grew up in the 90s, hip hop, Wu-Tang Clan, and if I come out, it's funny because if you see me hanging out with like friends of mine from back in the days in high school, it's a different Pinaki. And I can't bring that Pinaki exactly out in the corporate world because, you're not used to that. Some people might find that offensive and stuff like that, So I think there is a bit of like code switching that we do. And I remember one of the things that I did when going into the workplace, even from a cultural standpoint, like Indian family, just different traditions altogether. And I remember going into the workforce, I felt really wow, how do I act? I actually bought a book on etiquette it was called How to Be a Gentleman, with the idea that the gentleman approach is to keep everyone as comfortable as possible while still being true to your authentic self. And so that's what we're trying to do here is we're all coming from different places and we want to be our authentic selves, and we don't want to disrespect that authentic self. But at the same time, we're trying to keep everyone comfortable, right? Because my authentic self might be an a-hole or something like that, but I still want to keep people uncomfortable. That's a future episode coming up for you, those who don't know. But, and what you said about the honesty and it could come across wrong makes me think of this one gentleman, Brad Blanton. He came up with this book called Radical Honesty, and he's a psychologist, author, and he basically realized that most of his patients were getting anxiety from the little lies that they told themselves and others, whether it's small or big, and he came up with this idea called radical honesty. He might be one of those like influencers, but it was like everyone just be honest, right? And so it's like instead of saying, hey, I really enjoyed that dinner when you didn't, just say you didn't. Or instead of pretending you're interested in a boring conversation, just say you're bored. And it obviously it created a lot of drama at work, right? It's people quickly burn bridges, telling your boss that was a bad idea, wasn't a great idea, and but it really created bad workplace implications. So unfiltered truth is an interesting thing because the fact is truth is different for different people, right? And on top of the truth, we have to have some tact, humility, some empathy to who you're talking to. A quote that I heard from Kristen Hancock, who was the founder of Ecology, or one of the founders of Ecology, along with Chuck Gose. She said in a presentation once that honesty without compassion can be cruel. And that sticks with me whenever I'm thinking about feedback, whenever I'm thinking about how do I say this, is like really to kind of put myself into the other person's shoes and kind of understand that. So I can't not say it, but I have to say it, but in a way that's going to be productive for everyone. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. And shout out to Kristen Hancock for, just a great way of thinking about it. Because I think it's that's a great soundbite right there. In terms
Kristen is awesome.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah, I think the reason why it's so important to be honest is, just last semester, my daughter Audrey, she's in grade 10, her sophomore year, and she is having a hard time with her French teacher last year. They just couldn't get on last semester, they couldn't get on the same page. And one of the things that my wife and I, Sydney and I recognized was that she wasn't doing a really good job of advocating for herself. So we were encouraging her to just set up a chat with her teacher, maybe over the lunch hour or whatnot, and explain your side of the story. And I think in the absence of being able to be honest in the workplace, the way this sort of shows up is this happens a lot of times where people can't speak up with their manager if they don't agree with the manager. It brings me back to one of our early episodes from season 1. Why does it feel so wrong to disagree or say no to your boss? And be honest, I've got so much on my plate right now that I can take this on, but if I did, it just means that my ability to do it to the quality that I would love to be able to do it is going to be a little bit compromised because I'm being stretched thin, if I'm going to be really honest. And I do think it's important to be able to advocate for yourself. I remember, I might have mentioned this before, Pinaki, but a good friend of mine, Darren Deal, who we lost Darren a couple of years ago to lung cancer.
I'm sorry about that.
And he's just one of the best guys. But he used to work in media, and he used to have this coworker that the way he would create consensus after a meeting about an idea that he would propose is he would look everybody in the room one at a time. He would point like with 2 fingers at them. And this is the way he created consensus, Pinaki. He would say, rock and roll, rock and roll. It's like, great, we rock and roll. And it's such a weirdly awkward exchange where it gives you very little outs to be truly honest and say, you know what, Pinaki, I'm going to be honest, I don't rock and roll. I'm not on board with what we're talking about here or the idea that we're moving forward with, because there's that weird sort of pressure, and it's almost like it's closed-ended question. It's almost like a rhetorical question, right? Yeah. And I just kind of find it funny because I think a lot of people managers, in very subtle ways, engineer requests for feedback in a way that it almost feels like you're forced to drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a sales technique, actually. I think from like the 80s, I remember reading this, and I can't reference it, but it was kind of like the technique is to basically get people to keep saying yes before you get to the end. And it's like using pressure sales, social sales to do that. I think there's an episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, where they had to there's a bunch of experiments on that. What's interesting about all the 2 or 3 scenarios that you brought up, and one of the things that I found fascinating about this subject, it was I guess I got enlightened by a video that I watched from Heidi Priebe, and she's a psychologist, and she's been working in a thought leader on this space for a while, but she introduced me to the concept of fantasy relationships, which I thought was interesting because it works like this. Like, Chris, if you say something to me, hey, I love that new Wicked movie or whatever, wasn't it great, Pinaki, just like this. And I'm like, yeah, I liked it, but I actually didn't like it, right? If I say I liked it but didn't like it, we have now entered into a kind of fantasy relationship. One where you believe I liked Wicked, but it is not true. So your understanding of reality now is not actually reality, right? And, talking about a movie is a really small example, but what if the topic was big and important, right? What you were saying about that gentleman who's getting consensus in that way, right now, imagine that person did that and half of the room did not actually agree but said yes. What kind of fantasy world is that guy living in right now, right? So what is the ultimate truth becomes the heart of honesty here.
Right.
And that's an interesting thing to think, because I don't want to live in a fantasy relationship with anybody because that doesn't feel right. You know what I mean?
Well, and Pinaki, you had a great example of an interaction with one of your colleagues at Local Wisdom where she was explaining to you that what you think your employees think about you versus how they really think about you, there was a gap, right?
That's absolutely true. It's kind of one of the things as a leader I'm really keen on is I tell people often at Local Wisdom, look, I'm not afraid of falling. I'm not afraid of making a mistake. What I am afraid of is falling and making a mistake and not knowing it. So let me know, because as a leader, it's especially hard for someone to be truly honest with you when you have this sign on your head that said, I could fire you at any given moment, right? There's this power thing that I'm trying to dissolve so that we could truly be honest with each other and kind of remove any barriers that we have. So getting to Chris's story, this was Pinano Mikori. Love Pinano, fabulous human being, an amazing talent manager at Local Wisdom. She approached me and said that, Pinaki, I think that what you think people think about you and the company at Local Wisdom is different than what actually is true. And so I was like, okay, tell me so I could address it. And she was like, I can't. And I was like, well, what am I going to do with that? I said, I can't address it. I don't know what it is. And she was like, basically, She's our talent manager. She has spoken to people. But if she were to tell me that so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this type of thing, that would be breaking her trust with them. So she couldn't break that trust because trust and honesty and the heart and sincerity, like I was saying earlier, is core to local wisdom. So what we did do, or what she did do, is we held this thing called what we called a brand autopsy. And she held this with herself and Michelle Watts, who was our publicist at the time. Michelle Watts is also awesome. But they ran this exercise where it was a live meeting, key people and long tenured people from local wisdom. They were in the meeting. Panano facilitated this conversation with me and them. And I had no prep. The only prep that I knew that it was going to be bad and to be prepared for bad stuff. And I was like crapping myself before. But the conversation was probably the best conversation that we've ever had. And it actually changed the dynamics at Local Wisdom for the better in such a good way. This was at a time where a lot of change had happened. I hadn't been able to address a lot of the change or the reasons behind it. So it gave everyone the venue to ask questions, to dig behind the curtain, to see what is going on. And the rule that we had in this thing was that everybody was here. We're going to pull it out. We're going to break it down. We're going to talk about it. And we're going to move on from here on in. So this is your moment to talk about it and get rest, and get ease with anything that's bothering you. Because from here on in, it's go time, right? And it was a very interesting, ceremonious move into this new direction. It's kind of the basis of the programs that you and I are creating, because I'd love to be able to do this for other teams who are experiencing like either toxicity or stress on Sunday night because they have to go to work tomorrow, things like that. We want you to feel better about walking down that hallway in your office with your team. Sorry, I got into a little sales technique there.
No, 100%. And, I think when I think about what does it look like to create the conditions for honesty, I'm becoming more and more aware that there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. And so it reminds me of, my family and I at the dinner table when you ask the kids, so how was school today? It was fine. What'd you learn? Nothing. And I think there's a danger that this happens regularly with people managers where they ask, how's everything going? Good, great. Okay, Are we still on pace to deliver this project by Q2? And it just becomes like this thing where if someone just says, how's it going? How's it going is not a real question. No, right? It's almost always the answer is fine.
It's a greeting.
It's all good. You're never going to be satisfied with the answer. It doesn't really lead to good outcomes. And so
I'm careful, like in my one-on-ones with folks, is how's it going is always a question. And it's funny how often you hear the same thing, so you dig a little bit deeper. I do ask, are you working late? And are you working late often? Are you overworked? What's the stress situation like? One question that I ask, which I really like, what's your internal weather like? Is it stormy in there? Is it sunny? Is it a nice breeze?
That's fun.
That type of thing. So just to kind of break them out of things.
I don't think I've ever heard that one before. I'm gonna steal that one.
Steal it. I forgot where I got it from, but it was, what's your internal weather like today? Because it's like a what's the weather like question, which is also a greeting or an icebreaker type of thing there.
Well, I know someone, when you say, how's it going? This person used to always answer it with living the dream. And it's kind of funny because living the dream, there's definitely an air of sarcasm that comes along with it, right?
Are you in a simulation?
It's like, how's it going? Oh, living the dream. And maybe I wasn't even honest with myself about what that meant. Great, good. I'm glad you're living your dream. But really, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, when someone answers living the dream, it's sort of low key. It's a cry for help. It's just saying, well, it's a tinge of sarcasm that comes with it. And so maybe there's ways to equip people so that they can be better at detecting when their internal weather is a little bit overcast and dark and stormy. And for me, living the dream is a little bit of that code speak to say, well, honestly, it's not going that great, but I'm sure you don't want to hear my problems.
Yeah, that's an interesting interpretation too. Because I found at some points where you would kind of how's it going was just like a greeting, right? Like it's just a canned question that you ask when you see each other. And I think people created canned responses too, especially responses that'll get a little rile or laughter and things like that. I remember I got into this habit of saying same crap, different toilet bowl. Because I thought it was a funny thing, but it was at some point it gets passe it or whatever, and everyone has heard it, so you don't say it anymore. But it's, yeah, how do you answer that question is a good thing. And I wonder, now I'm going to pay attention to cries for help and living the dream and things like that.
I think it's probably all around us as well in terms of that code speak. It's kind of like that famous sort of idea about how realtors, when they're trying to market the property that's for sale, they have code speak, so it doesn't sound bad, but it's kind of bad. So like
Yeah.
they'll use words like handyman's dream or intimate, which is code for it's a really
Small.
tiny place, or things like that. And
Spin. That's spin, right?
it is spin, and it makes me think about how the culture of honesty. I think a lot of times there's a lot of organizations, because they don't want to inspire panic or stress or anxiety amongst the broader team. I think it does go both ways, because a lot of times organizations will try to put a positive spin on something that is quite overtly a negative thing for the organization, but they're trying really hard to spin it a little bit. And I think that starts to create the conditions for it going both ways, which is an employee is struggling, but then they're going to say, no, it's fine. Everything's great. Like, I can't believe how much I love everything that's going on here right now. And I think, what would it look like for a CEO to come out and be a little bit truthful, but do it in a way so that it's getting in the way of, not stoking panic or additional gossip at the water cooler. But I think just having that, fostering that level of trust and that authenticity, it's always going to be important for leaders and organizations.
It is. And the history on this one has been really fascinating. When I kind of dug into it from a historical perspective, we've been talking about honesty since the ancient philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and more. So there's a conversation that started 470 BC. So it's wild how centuries ago we're still grappling with the same questions about ethic, truth, and good living as we are today, right? They were questioning the basics of critical thinking and questioning to kind of learn, talking about ethics, virtual, as well as stoicism kind of started at that, which kind of really kind of talked about self-control and acceptance. Industrial revolution is when we started now turning human labor into more complex mathematical and economic concepts, which is interesting. So you start to see a little bit of a shift from what we were talking about earlier, abstracting humans. And in the 1980s came a weird time of this weird power era. This is the Wolf and Wall Street type of greed is good type of mentality that somehow came out over business, which is really interesting. Well, where honesty was less profitable than persuasion, right? And BS found its way into the work world. And we saw repercussions of that, in the late 80s and 90s, right? Corporate scandals and white collar crime rose. Short-term profits basically became a big thing to kind of make investors happy. And that's where layoffs became a thing, right? CEO pay during that time skyrocketed, and that created a bigger wealthy inequality. And that's where also in the 80s and 90s is where that birth of workaholism and burnout culture kind of started. And it's kind of changed interesting forms as we went into the 2000s, because people were tired of this greed after the bubble burst and corporate scandals. We were we don't trust you companies anymore. And that hurt for a lot of companies. And people want to believe that the companies that they work for actually have their backs, right? And that was in danger. And that's where I think that idea of employee experience and culture formation and employee value propositions and things like that came into side. But on one side, it's kind of aimed at making the company look like it's a great place to work and a safe place to work. And also on the other side, it was also aimed at siphoning as much as we can out of people to get maximum productivity and stuff like that. And two things are very interesting kind of odds with each other, but that's what started this dissonance between HR slogans and value propositions and real work culture. And it's an interesting kind of thing. But today, right, even despite all this kind of talk about transparency and authenticity, it's still a minefield of half-truths and omissions and corporate jargon. We had an episode on that. It's still there. Because I'm still in this place of you just said a lot of words, but what does that mean? It's we're trapped in this mashup of The Office and Severance. We don't know how to escape this, right? That's why this conversation is important, though.
Yeah, and that's a great show. The other show I was thinking about too, which I also love on Apple TV, is Ted Lasso. And one of the things that is like very refreshing about the Ted Lasso character, so no spoilers, don't worry about it if you've not watched it, but I highly recommend it.
Agreed.
But in this show, the Jason Sudeikis character, Ted Lasso, he plays a coach that used to coach American football, and then the owner of a British soccer team hires him with the idea that it's going to torpedo the team, right? Just to have somebody who knows nothing about soccer. And it was really interesting how when he addressed the team, Ted Lasso's character was very open and honest and acknowledging that he has no experience with soccer. And despite being hired as a head coach of a professional soccer team, he comes from an American football background and really doesn't understand the strategy or anything like that. And so instead of pretending that he knows what he's talking about and I'm the boss, you have to do what I say. He's very upfront. He's very honest. He admits that he's learning as he goes, and he's relying on his coaching staff and his players to help him understand the nuances of the game better. And I think that honesty helped him build trust and respect within the team as they see this willingness to be vulnerable, to be honest, and this commitment to learning and improving. And so, that supportive and environment where there's a willingness to grow, whatever your title is, I think is really refreshing. And it always makes me think of a lot of people in that same position as Ted Lasso would probably think about it more in terms of having that imposter syndrome. And I'm the coach. I better pretend like I know what I'm doing and, play that game. And I actually just think it creates for a worse environment for the team. Like the team dynamic will start to break down very quickly, I think.
It's very true. And it's very stressful in that way. And people could see through it, I think. Just maybe like our first few episodes, perhaps, that didn't feel right. But I created that one value that I talk about, heart and sincerity, because of a lot of mistakes that I've made. Because every time I've kind of went down the path, this was when I was much more younger, gone down the path of manipulation or lying or dishonesty, you realize that you have to remember all of that stuff and keep tabs of all that stuff. And one slip up causes a whole array of problems. So I'm like, you know what? Life is just so much easier the other way around, to just be honest and tell people that I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll figure it out, I think there's a lot of research on the topic too, like the mum effect. Basically, there's research that shows that people avoid delivering bad news to protect themselves, not others, but they do it to protect themselves, which is also ironically worsens the situation. And then there's this misinterpretation of what happens as an outcome of honesty. So research shows that most people often over-predict or emphasize the negative impact of an honest communication and kind of underestimate the positives about it. So they're kind of overestimating the social impact or the cost that's going to happen if they're honest. But so we basically fail when it comes to predicting how people will react to our honest truths, which usually happens to our benefit, right? So just different things keep in mind as you're kind of approaching situations of honesty and things like that, is that don't stress over what could happen if you're honest, and in a sincere way, right? Not trying to, not trying to fool someone, or not trying to coerce someone into something, or not trying to get overly personal or strange. But when you're really trying to communicate something real that'll help the situation, don't feel like it's going to kind of be terrible the other way around, especially if the situation you're currently in is not good. Like when you're talking about your daughter, right? So she had to kind of get through this mode of, I have to summon up this courage to speak to this authority figure who has this control over my future via a grade that he or she could give me. So I'm going to get over this fear, this misprediction of what bad could happen by talking to this person, right?
Yeah, and I think that dynamic that we've touched on quite a bit in this episode, Pinaki, is probably at the root of why there's a hesitancy to be more honest, which is, it's when you talk to your manager and you mess something up, it's really hard to talk about it because you're worried that it's going to affect your ability to get a raise next year, or a promotion, or that the way that you're looked at is going to be diminished in some way. And so we find different ways to have just kind of nonsense. It's kind of like at that job interview when someone asks, what are your weaknesses? Nobody's really honest about it. They just come up with just nonsense. Like, oh, my weaknesses is I work a little bit too hard, and work-life balance, and I'm a perfectionist. And, it's just these things where it's not, I think you're trying hard to make it sound like it's a weakness, but really you're trying to position something. So like, I'm the best, I'm perfect, and these are actually strengths. I know you're going to look at it as a strength, but I'm going to tell you my weakness.
It's like an outdated interview technique and answer type of thing. I answer by saying garbanzo beans and hummus because I'm allergic. That's my weakness.
I love it.
Not that I've been interviewed for a job in a really long time.
Yeah, me too. And I think that's where the stakes are much higher, because it becomes the difference between I'm going to get this job or I'm not going to get this job, or my ability to negotiate pay. And it is a pressure cooker in a job interview, because you do want to try to look as perfect as you can. Right?
Yeah.
It's like the first time you date somebody, like you're not really going to go
the wooing
too deep
process.
It's the wooing process. It's going to be the new shirt that you just bought, and you just got a haircut just for this interview, those kinds of things. And I think, the dynamic poses for like it being a lot harder, to be honest. Just before we wrap up here, Pinaki, I wanted to ask you a question. So do you feel like some people are simply not ready to hear the truth, because on some level, maybe there's lots of people who might not even be honest with themselves?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, and there's some people that don't know, right? There's that part of us that we don't see, but other people see, right? And there's that part of us that we see and others don't see, right? And there kind of lies the different areas for filling the gap with honesty. But I think we have to be honest. If we care about someone, if we want them to grow, we have to talk to them about it. We have to bring it up. Again, we have to do it with some sense of empathy, compassion, and understanding from where they're coming from, right? And timing plays a part. Like you said, they might not be ready, and they might not ever be ready, but there is a kind of better time and a worse time to convey, have this kind of honest conversation, right? It's not while you're like, whatever, getting ready for work or something like that. So we have to kind of figure out the right atmosphere. I was actually having a conversation with a good friend of mine, Kathiari, who's a senior level marketing and comms person. We were also talking about kids. And he has a 10-year-old where we're talking about, finding the right time and place to be honest. And even as a parent, being honest with yourself, like you were saying, I think earlier, about your child has to go through certain pains to grow, right? In that vein, it's like we have to learn ourselves. All right, I have to be honest with myself. I'm protecting my own pain of seeing my own child go through pain. So I have to be honest with myself to know that I'm going to go through that pain myself, right? But I think honesty is a really important topic. I think managers have to be open with it. We have to create a culture for honesty, because if you don't have that, I think honesty in the workplace has a lot to do with the pressure at the moment. So if we kind of think about beyond employee and managers, I think if we are in an organization that has, say, a big project due, and we have promises and pressures to make it happen, that could lead to dishonest behavior. And like the NASA space shuttle incident, the Challenger incident was a big example of that, where NASA at the time had this culture of, don't yell chicken little, right? I think, or, don't yell chicken, so we have to go through it, right? So there was engineer concerns the hours before that weren't actually acknowledged. When there's an looming pressure for quality, right? And this happens a lot for in hospital institutions and things like that. Companies, they may think about honesty as risky. We don't want people to know how often people wash their hands, or how, in hospitals and things like that. So and especially when you kind of create this reward or retribution system, that's also a tricky place, because people are then incentivized to potentially hide mistakes or over index on successes, instead of addressing or doing the real thing or trying to game the system, right? And at the end of the day, there's always going to be some kind of pressure, because companies have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. So the idea is we have to be careful of, there'll always be pressure. we have to be careful which kind of, I guess, dials we want to like put the pressure up on, because depending on those dials, it could like create other bursts in the pipes. Trying to make an analogy out of thin air here. But does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I feel like we could talk about this topic for hours, but I just want to wrap this up. But I think that's about does it, Pinaki. There's so much to talk about in terms of honesty in the workplace, and it's going to be a theme throughout probably most of our episodes, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And we do have this new segment for this season. It's
That's
wisdom
right.
that feels so right. And so Pinaki and I, we shout out a lot of references and things like that. So we'll talk about that. But before we just dive into it, I just want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. But especially I want to thank Local Wisdom for making this podcast episode possible, and the great work that you do with your clients in terms of digital communications. And we know that so many of the efforts that you do are great. And of course, I want to give big ups to Brielle Saracini, our producer. You've been our rock, and I'm just so appreciative of you keeping Pinaki and me organized and on track. And of course, the amazing team at SBX Productions, Vince Quinn, Taylor Credatus, Bill Cornfield. You do amazing work to help bring our podcast dream to life. And so a big thank you to you on that as well. But all right, Pinaki, let's go into it.
Let's get into it.
Let's talk about wisdom that feels so right. And we dropped a couple of references. One of the ones and we've talked about this probably in so many of our episodes, but fostering and creating the conditions for honesty, I think, starts with the famous work that Amy Edmondson has done, not only in the Fearless Organization, her book, but also she does a TED Talk where she talks about psychological safety. And I think that's the underpinning of that environment where you can feel a little bit safer to be honest and to talk about things in a more candid way. Because I think in the absence of that, it stunts organizations' ability to be innovative and to grow if you don't know what the actual truth is.
Totally. That book actually inspired a few thoughts for me as far as understanding that inauthentic or stressful behaviors, which end up becoming successful, are replicated. So we have to be careful of that. So definitely a great book. Another book I'll shout out is from Jenny Fields. She recently launched a book, Nobody Believes You. And it's really about like leaderships and she kind of identifies 8 practices of credible leadership. And it's interesting because not many books or topics are talking about that, especially post-pandemic, right? You think credibility and trustworthy in leadership is important right now. And so that's a great book to look at. I also I often talk about this book a lot as well, Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When the Stakes Are High. And that's by Kerry Patterson. Oldie but goodie. It's one of those books that lets you realize that, when confronted by one of those difficult conversations, most of us are in this like fight or flight mode, and neither of them works. So Kerry gives a really good framework on how to handle those types of conversations as well. And finally, go ahead, up to you.
I was just going to say, there's another shout out for a video that's on YouTube. It's only 2 minutes long, but I think it's really fascinating. And it's Simon Sinek, the author of Starting With Why. Simon Sinek talks about his work with the Navy SEALs, and he talks about, the trade-offs between performance and trust. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to come to find the conclusion that the Navy SEALs prioritize trust over performance. And even in an environment where there's low performance but high levels of trust, the way he talks about it is that that's a temporary state, because it's kind of like with Ted Lasso. In the beginning, you're losing games, the head coach doesn't know what they're doing, but when there's that strong bond of trust, over time, the performance will start to catch up and become, a strong point for the team.
That's super good. That's so true. It's a really good one, especially like military analogies like that. Bill Kuehler, my co-founder at Resource here, said this really interesting thing for me. It was like relationship and trust is based on trust and credibility. And so you put the example out as, okay, you're going down a ladder from an helicopter, and you have to jump down this canyon in this fog so you can't really see the floor. Somebody's already down there and says, hey, it's good, jump. now you have two things. You have to, one, trust that this person is telling the truth, and two, know that this person is knowledgeable enough to know that you could land that jump without hurting yourself. So think about those things as you're like out there and talking to folks. You want to establish both of those things. You are telling the truth and you're smart enough to know this is right. And if either of those is wrong or you're not sure about either of those, say it. And so people know exactly where you are, so you're not living a fantasy relationship. And with that said, thank you all. You know what? If this talk about trust and honesty made you think a little bit differently, if it made you laugh or actually kind of get filled with a sense of dread over like the world that's happening around us with trust, then we want to hear about it. Connect with us on LinkedIn. Don't forget to rate us, review us, share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues, and if you're feeling brave enough, share it with your boss. If you want to give a hint, feel free to do that. We'll be happy to be, a note from your moms to talk to them. Again, thank you so much for listening. Can't wait to see you again. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. Be well.